As many of you know, the government's long-awaited integrated review was billed as the most radical reassessment of Britain's place in the world since the Cold War. Ahead of its release, questions abound about whether it would actually put some meat on the bones of what a post-Brexit global Britain really looked like, or whether it would be a bit of a letdown, whether it would serve to justify some of the spending decisions already made or genuinely chart a new path. Now, the reaction's been mixed. We were given an idea of how the government defines global Britain, one based on openness, on the UK being a force for good, with emphasis on science and technology in both military and economic security, and with action on climate change, health risks, and providing resilience at home and abroad. There was surprise at the extent of the content and its less hubristic tone, perhaps providing some acknowledgement of the UK's status now as a middle power. But there was also support for the noises around greater international cooperation and cross-government integration. But there was also disappointment at the many gaps and contradictions in its provisions, and perhaps most fundamentally, the huge gulf between what the government says it wants to do and its actions at home and abroad that undermine many of its objectives. So we're here today to pick apart some of these announcements, some of the contradictions, and look at the review from a defence, a diplomacy, and a development perspective. And as Labour prepares its own international policy review under the leadership of Wayne David MP, we also want to look at what Labour might do differently. So our speakers have been invited here today to do just that. After our speaker remarks, we will have a Q&A, which will be chaired by Sarah Church. If you have any questions as we're going, please do put them in the chat box. You can mention, and if you could mention who they're addressed to as you go, that would be really helpful. I'd now like to hand over to David Taylor to introduce you to the people you've really come here to hear from today. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks very much, Jess. And as Jess said, I'm from the Labour Campaign for International Development. We are obviously interested in the development parts of this review, but we have always advocated for a whole government approach to tackling poverty and injustice around the world. So obviously we have an interest in all parts of it, including, and this is less well known about the work that LCID does, we have a campaign on the responsibility to protect civilians around the world. So that's clearly been an interest to us as well. And this new conflict centre is an interesting development in an otherwise disappointing review. But not here to hear from me, here to hear from our brilliant speakers. And I wanted to first introduce Wayne David MP, who is the Shadow Minister for the Middle East and North Africa, and who is also conducting Labour's own review into international policy, a strategic international policy review, which no doubt he'll talk about. And I wanted to start by asking him to give both his response to the review and to talk a bit about the review that Labour is going to be doing as well. So over to you, Wayne.
Well, thank you very much indeed, David. And could I begin by saying congratulations to all the organisers of this event, in particular the Labour Party Foreign Policy Group, the Labour Campaign for International Development, and the Labour Friends of the Forces. It's excellent that you've come together to organise this, and it's a very, very topical discussion which we're about to have. Could I begin by saying that I believe the concept of an integrated review is sound. It makes sense for all government departments to have an interface and involvement with the world, to have a common set of objectives and to be pulling in the same direction in the British national interest. I always find it is quite bizarre, really, that we've had government departments who have traditionally operated across the world, but done so really without any relation quite often to other government departments. And their priorities were almost hermetically sealed from other government departments. So I think it makes sense, really, for there to be a common set of goals and principles underlining government policy. So the idea of an integrated review is, I think, good. But what we have before us is enormously problematic. And as Jessica, you said in your introduction, there are contradictions. And I think the contradictions really stem from the political reality in which the government is located. I think that is a huge contradiction between the government's own rhetoric and what is commonly seen as the national interest, especially around the rhetoric of Brexit. Because I think what Boris Johnson always is his position essentially to the Brexit process. And much of the rhetoric around Brexit was about Britain standing alone in the world, about Britain recreating its neo-imperial past, about exercising diplomatic and military influence in a way which is frankly unrealistic and indeed undesirable. But that rhetoric has been a millstone around the government's neck, and it has influenced really the backdrop, at least, to the integrated review. But if there's a contradiction there, there's also a contradiction inside the document itself and what is happening in reality in terms of the government's actual practical policies. I'll give a few examples. The document talks very reasonably, I think, about Britain upholding international law. But the reality is that the government itself is playing fast and loose with international law. Just look at what happened with regard to Brexit and Northern Ireland. It talks about the desirability of Britain to be actively involved in peacekeeping. In December, for example, there were 300 British peacekeepers deployed to Mali in Africa. But yet the government at the same time is cutting back on aid and actually creating problems in those areas it is seeking to create stability and peace. And I'm talking about aid. I'm sure Sarah will say a lot more about this. But the document talks about Britain being renowned for its leadership across the world in terms of development policy. And that has been the case in the past, but it's not the case now, when we are in the business of cutting back on development aid and reneging on our commitment for 0.7% of our GDP to be committed to development policy. And just look at the appalling situation in Yemen, where at an international conference, Britain announced it was reducing its aid by 50%, and yet we are a United Nations penholder as far as Yemen is concerned, and we have a key role to play in trying to achieve peace, stability, and aid. Could I say too that the document talks about Britain wanting to have and I quote, a constructive and productive relationship with the European Union. Absolutely correct. But the document doesn't say anything about what our future diplomatic, foreign policy, military relationship and partnership is going to be with the European Union. When we left the European Union, nothing was said about it then. Nothing is really being said about it now. Yet it's fundamentally important in terms of Britain's future relationship with Europe and with the world. And could I also say that the document talks eloquently about the need for the United Kingdom to be a, quote, soft power superpower. There's much in that. But why is it then cutting back on a BBC World Service? Why is it reducing support for our diplomatic presence throughout the world? Why is it, in effect, reducing Britain's extremely important influence and our ability to engage positively with our partners throughout the world? But I think the biggest contradiction and the biggest problem in many ways is on the issue of defense. The document talks about the need for taking a lead in the world with regard to nuclear disarmament. Absolutely. It's been happening quietly for the last 50 years. But the document then goes on to propose that Britain increases its warhead capacity from a cap of 180 warheads to 260 without any justification or explanation of why this £10 billion expense should be incurred. And I think that is a fundamentally important problem. And I'd be really interested to hear what George in particular has to say about that, because some people have suggested that this implies a fundamental reorientation of Britain's defence, so that for the first time ever, Britain may well be prepared to consider the use of tactical nuclear weapons, because those warheads haven't got to be necessarily targeted at cities. It can be much smaller and used in a military setting. Now, if that is the case, the government ought to come clear and we ought to have a fundamental debate about it. So these are just a few comments I've got to make about the document. There's plenty on it to discuss, but the fundamental point I would make is that there's a huge mismatch between the rhetoric of the document and the reality of government policy today. But I think we've taken a modest step forward in acknowledging the need for greater coordination and integration of our foreign policy dimensions, but let's make sure we have the right policies matching what we're declaring that we need to have. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Wayne. That was a really great opening remark from you. And I'd like to now hand over to the Right Honourable Lord Robertson, who was Secretary of State for Defence between 97 and 99, and then became the 10th Secretary General of NATO from 1999 to 2004. And it'd be great, George, if you could please speak to the defence questions raised in this review. And I wondered in particular your views on the modernisation of the forces that it proposes and what the review and that tilt towards the Indo-Pacific means for our place in NATO. Over to you.
Well, let me do that, but I think there's other issues that, I think we need to touch on before that. And I agree very much with what Wayne said about the mismatch of ambitions and reality, because that's at the heart of the problem of the credibility of the government as it puts forward this this integrated review. Indeed, they call it an integrated review, and that's certainly the objective. But they produced one bit of it last week, another bit on Monday, and they're doing the defence industrial policy. I think probably in the next 15 minutes, we'll have the announcement of that. So it's not very integrated in terms of the presentation at all. But the basis of the integrated review is quite right, as Wayne said. Bringing together all the different components is precisely right. When I did the review in 1998, our strategic defence review, it was based on a foreign policy baseline, which I agreed in advance with Robin Cook. So it was based on what Britain's foreign policy was going to be. And of course, it included aspects of development. At the time, Claire Short was the International Development Secretary, and we actually worked so closely together that Tribune newspaper eventually called her Bomber Short, because she was so identified with what we did, especially in Kosovo. So the degree of integration here is not as they would have liked us to have, but the foreign policy aspects in the review are actually quite good. They're largely written by John Bew, who wrote the acclaimed biography of Clement Attlee, and his fingerprints are all over it. So it's comprehensive, it's thought through, it's ambitious, it's actually quite exhaustive, and it would be very difficult for a Labour government to produce anything different to that. But it's the problem of execution that really it comes down to here. As Wayne says, they say in the document diplomacy first, and yet they've reduced the diplomatic service to the point where the old Foreign Office budget was actually less than the cost of building the US Embassy in London, and the United States of America employs more people in Britain than the Foreign Office employs in the whole of the world. So diplomacy first is a bit of a slogan, but it's not really based on reality. They say in it explicitly that we will lead by example, but as Wayne says, the British government's approach to the Northern Ireland Protocol and the Overseas Services Bill, even more importantly, which doesn't just break a protocol like the Northern Ireland Protocol, but is actually in danger of breaking international humanitarian law and the Geneva Convention. So I think they're going to have a problem with credibility when it comes to trying to sell some of the notions that are in the review as a whole. It also, as Wayne says, and this is quite an important thing in the context of defence, is we'll work with allies, principally with the United States of America, which is no surprise. but the absence of any thought given to our relationship with the European Union and with strategic autonomy and with the relationship that we would have to develop with the growing identity of Europe in the defence sphere is as many commentators have said, a gaping hole in the middle of the review as a whole. So on the defence side of it, the defence announcement yesterday, I would go along with quite a lot of it. When I was in the Ministry of Defence, I didn't cut enough the heavy metal components of the army. We still had too many tanks because people were trying to sell them abroad. And it makes sense to look at the new domains of cyber and space and other threats that we face in the world today. The only problem is that it's at the expense of the hard power elements of the army. Of course, it's easy to cut the army because that gives you instant savings. You can't cut your equipment budget by much, although they've done some of that. So you cut the manpower, and it makes you much less credible in terms of what you can actually take to any coalition that might be created under the NATO umbrella. It also leaves major capability gaps. This was the problem with the Defence Review of 2010, because it sort of said, well, we're going to have the aircraft carriers, but we're not going to have any planes on them. That you're going to leave yourself gaps in capability in the interim period, and they haven't really properly thought that through at the same time. They've gone for the glamorous side of what we do, rather than the easy cuts that can be made. Okay, two other major points. One is the nuclear warheads. Well, I've been complaining bitterly to the Defence Secretary and to others in the government about any explanation of why we're increasing the cap. Actually, we're not increasing the physical numbers of warheads, because a lot of warheads were kept in reserve, so it isn't as big as it looks like, and we're still left with a warhead arsenal that is less than the French one, as I think they've repeatedly said. It appears to be related to the increasing expenditure by Russia and by China on nuclear weapons. And they are inventing new systems, including tactical systems. And by the way, you can't use ballistic missile warheads for tactical purposes, Wayne. So we have only one system. I abolished the other system that we had, and we're the only nuclear power with one particular system. But it seems to be based on a realistic assessment of the range of both defensive and offensive nuclear weapons being built up in complete defiance of the NPT by Russia and China at the present moment. And the other point is the Indo-Pacific, the tilt to the Indo-Pacific. Now, I was on the Policy Exchange Blue Ribbon panel that they established to look at the Indo-Pacific, but I parted company with them on the idea that we were going to have military presence east of Suez. The Indo-Pacific region is going to be hugely important in trade terms to this country. And at the same time as we're sanctioning senior people in China, we're also saying in the integrated review that we're going to maintain a trade relationship there as well. But there are other countries apart from China in the region. And if we're going to be a trading nation post-Brexit, then we've got to have a tilt towards that, but not one that recreates the military presence east of Suez. A final thought is that the integrated review talks about Britain aiming to take over senior positions in international organizations. And as somebody who led an international organization, I know how valuable that can be for individual countries. There are 20 international organizations who set standards in the world today. China has the head of 4 of them. No other country in the world has more than one country at the head of these organizations. We have none. So that's an objective that we want to. But in the meantime, they're trying to undermine Patricia's Scotland as Secretary General of the Commonwealth, the one Brit who actually heads a major international organisation. So yet again, another contradiction. I'll leave it at that.
Thanks very much, George. That was fascinating run through from your perspective. I'd like to hand over to the Right Honourable Jack Straw, who was Labour's Foreign Secretary between 2001 and 2006, of course. And Jack, obviously it's over to you to cover whatever you want, but from my perspective, it'd be really great to hear, if you were Foreign Secretary today and you were conducting this review, what would be your priorities? And also, what's the sort of infrastructure you would put in place to deliver that? And how does it compare with the review that has been put forward? Over to you.
Thanks, David, very much. And thank you to everybody for organising this seminar, and to my colleagues, George and Wayne, for what they have said. So, I mean, on the resources, let me just answer that first, David. I mean, there's bound to be an argument in any government between the overseas departments, defence, foreign affairs, DFID, and to some extent the intelligence agencies, although they've done pretty well really since 9/11 in terms of their resources, about money. And it has been particularly acute until just recently, the cut from 0.7 to 0.5% in DFID's money for the Ministry of Defence and for the Foreign Office. Ministry of Defence, because its numbers are quite significant. The Foreign Office, because there's almost a sort of cultural argument which has been going on for decades between the Foreign Office and the Treasury. I mean, it's really, as already been pointed out, it's very small beer, the amount the Foreign Office spends around the world. But there's I say it's cultural. I used to complain about the Treasury being that on a TOF count, there were many more TOFs in the Treasury than there were in the Foreign Office in those days and these days, except they all walked around wearing suede shoes and so pretended they weren't. And there was some truth in that. But resources is an issue. And as Keir brought out in the House when he responded to the integrated review on the 16th of March, the rhetoric of the paper is set against their record on spend, including a 45,000 reduction in troop numbers. I mean, astonishing. Think what would have happened if Labour had presided over that in the last 10 years, and constant squeezes on the resources in every other area, including these days international development. And that, I mean, it also reflects this overriding tension at the heart of government between Boris Johnson's instincts to spend and dish out largesse, and the Treasury under Rishi Sunak, which is very strongly reverting to type, to essentially the Osborne economic framework, which is that British government should always spend less and less proportionately of their national income, which is why you've got this. On the document itself, I mean, I agree with what George and Wayne have said. The document itself is unexceptional, it seemed to me. It got a fair press and was welcomed, for example, in the US, it was welcomed in Japan, it was even welcomed by diplomats in France. And it doesn't have the kind of awful rhetoric that we've come to expect from Boris Johnson. So that's good. It's a quite measured tone. The significance is for this gap in terms of the absence of resources to follow through a lot of it, but also in respect of what it doesn't say. It's extraordinarily silent on the Middle East. So if you make a word search for Palestine or Palestinians, you get a nil return. Ditto Middle East peace process. Israel is mentioned twice, both times as part of a security relationship, which I don't disagree with. But the Middle East even though it's less significant in terms of global energy resources, particularly since the United States has become self-sufficient, is still a tinderbox, and you need a strategy for handling it. And although the issue of Middle East peace has gone off the boil popularly, it's still there in what's happening on the West Bank. And if the Labour Party, as I hope it is looking for issues where, reflecting its own values, it can chart out a different approach from the government on many foreign policy issues. That's difficult. Then I think Middle East peace policy, where Douglas Alexander and I and other colleagues were a few years back about recognizing a Palestinian state and just pushing the government on this, I think it is really important. Saudi Arabia and also the Yemen. Relations with Saudi Arabia are really difficult, and I won't pretend to you they were easy when I was there, not the least because, for example, in Lancashire, right across Lancashire, thousands of jobs depend on selling arms to Saudi Arabia. And it's okay if you're in London talking about this and don't just end these arms sales. It becomes rather more acute if the only decent, I mean, in engineering, British Aerospace across Lancashire provide a very significant proportion of the great jobs in engineering. And you can change that, but it would take you a very long time. So that's always produces hesitation by the British government and by Labour politicians as much as Tories. But I don't think that's any excuse for the absolutely abject position we've taken on arms sales, which are then used for the Yemen, because I don't approve of what Iran's done there, but it's had a far less significant presence than has the Yemen and the UAE, and it's been completely hopeless from their point of view. So that's one area. It doesn't mention anything about the Jcpoa, the nuclear deal with Iran. Really important, and it was to the credit of the British government that they continued the process that we in the Labour government had started, which led to the 2015 deal, and stayed in the deal. But we've got to now get it revived, and that's about getting the Biden administration to do what it said it's going to do, which is under certain conditions to rejoin the Jcpoa. And that should not just be a bit of a point of principle for us, but Iran is more susceptible to external political pressures, and its politics can be molded by what happens externally. So Trump's withdrawal from the Jcpoa has strengthened the conservative hardliners very strongly. If my view, if Biden was to get back into the Jcpoa, that could have a significant impact on the presidential elections which are coming up there in June. A couple of other issues. One is on Europe, and I agree with what colleagues have said about that, because it's fine for the document to mention that we export 20% of our exports to the United States, but we export 40% to Europe, and Europe remains our closest neighbour. And I mean, there's nodding reference to the joint expeditionary force and to the CJEF, which we have with France. But there isn't, as George has said, there isn't a strategy there for engaging in Europe. And okay, we're not going to rejoin. That's not the issue. But precisely because we're not rejoining, we need even more engaged diplomatic strategy, bilaterally and with the European Union in Brussels, than we had when we were members, because so much business could be done incidentally when you were at other EU meetings. Last 2 points. One is on Russia. I mean, we don't have that much economic interest in what Russia's doing. Indeed, its economy is pretty piddling in relative terms. We have a really significant concern about its politics. One of the things where, again, I think Labour front bench might want to make some ground with the Conservatives is over Germany's continued attachment to the direct pipeline between Russia and Germany, Nord Stream 2. Because if this goes ahead, and the Germans are sort of right on the edge about this, and not helped by the fact the former Chancellor is director of Gazprom. But if this goes ahead, Russia can literally turn the tap off fuel supplies to a significant part of Europe. And we need to be using our diplomatic muscle to get the Europeans, particularly Germans, to appreciate that, or at least for them to pay some price of embarrassment on that. And my very last point, David, is about China. Keir Starmer was right to point out it when he responded to this document about the inconsistency of the government's approach to China, because we have the George Osborne approach, which is basically if we're just nice to them and join all their banks, they'll somehow change their approach. Well, we've learned, and it's been salutary for those of us who would have Western liberal values, that our assumption, which was that you couldn't have a dynamic, as it was, semi-private enterprise economy with lots of innovation, if you weren't allowing innovation of ideas on the political sphere. Well, they've proved that one wrong, I'm afraid. They've also become ruthless and much more powerful. Now, when George and I were in government, for our own reasons as a society, and same applied in Europe, not least low inflation, we allowed there to be a flood of cheap imports from China, knocking out considerable parts of our low-value manufacturing. So we need them, but it seems to me that we need a strategy to reduce our dependence on China economically, which is what you've got at the moment, and then to make up our mind, yes, we should carry on having diplomatic relations with them and trying to do business with them. But I have to say I'm uneasy about the idea that we should see them as an investment opportunity, as we do other countries in the Far East. And I don't think that's the case from my point of view. So a document itself, which is unexceptionable, but I think plenty of opportunity for the Labour front bench and the Labour Party more generally to try and expose the glaring inconsistencies in the document, and above all, in its likely execution. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jack. A really great tour around the world, ending in China. And of course, we had the vote yesterday on the Genocide Amendment, which ourselves and the Labour Foreign Policy Group have been campaigning on to support the front bench position. And as we saw, only 18 votes in it, but that really shows, brings to life the point you've just made, Jack, about the contradictions that we have in dealing with China, although we did at least get those limited sanctions as a concession, which is something, I guess. But anyway, I'd like to now move on finally to Sarah Champion MP, who is the chair of the International Development Select Committee. And last year was a difficult year, of course, with DFID being abolished, and we fought for a while that the IDC might go with it, but Sarah fought a really brilliant defensive campaign, which we supported with, to keep the IDC. And so turning to development, and we agree with you, Sarah, that development was largely absent in this review. In particular, they mention an international development strategy coming down the line. It'd be great if you could, among the other things you comment on, talk about some of the things that you'd like to see in that international development review when it does come out. So over to you, Sarah.
Thank you. And thank you, David, and also many people that are on this call for all the help that they did to make sure that we do still have the International Development Select Committee to try and scrutinise what's going on. I'm really glad that you're all here tonight, not least because I was just thinking about it while everyone was talking. We will have probably had more consultation and input from stakeholders in this debate tonight than probably went into the integrated review, because I'm yet to find any stakeholder who was able to feed in. And I want you to remember that this review should have come out a year ago. So you would have hoped that all of the contradictions and inconsistencies within it would have been ironed out by then, and all of the policies and more detail that we were hoping for would have been worked up and presented at the same time. Unfortunately, that's not the case, not just for development, but for many of the sort of the bigger areas. So the Conflict Resolution Centre, the cybersecurity, for example, where you would expect more detail at this point. I'm coming at this from a pure development point of view, but from the position that, and I paraphrase, that if people have got full tummies, then most wars are avoided. And I'd hoped that the integration of defence, development and diplomacy would have understood that concept and would have really been an excellent opportunity to unite all of those, unite all of our resources to try and see a more stable and secure and prosperous world. Unfortunately, in the 120 pages of it, development only got 3 pages. And then when you look at women, gender was mentioned once and women a couple of times. And it's that, for me, the frustration that here was an opportunity to put forward a really strong vision of what the world could be and how Britain could make that happen. And I think they ducked it. I'm inclined to agree with George. I think there's been some really expert work that's gone into this, but then I don't know about my colleagues, but I see the footprints of politicians with their red pens on the final draft, sort of inserting their little lines and pet projects in, and it's to the detriment of the report overall. Going back to development, I have to talk about the cut to development. So we've gone from 15 billion to 10 billion, still an awful lot of money. And within the document, there is sort of the talk of the 0.7 and returning when fiscal circumstances allow. But I want to say to you that the commitments in the document are also to exceed the NATO 2% on defence, which you know I completely support. That's 188 billion where we stand at the moment, and that's an increase of 3.5%. And one can't help wondering, had 5 billion from that budget being put back into development, then maybe we could meet our strategic objectives and be a safer place because of that. The Indo-Pacific tilt is interesting because the document does recognise the issues around Africa, both in terms of sort of poverty, development and security. So one can only assume this strong mention of the Indo-Pacific tilt, and it doesn't go into that much details about what countries they're talking about, but one can only assume that that is from a trade perspective. And then one also has to make the jump that that's what's underlying a lot of this document. I think Jack was right to talk about China. So there's the recognition of the threat, but also the trade opportunities. And I get that, you know, our relationships with countries are very complex, but what I would like to see more is some of the sort of the baselines that we were working on with that relationship going forward. And I think they duck actually doing that. I completely agree that the security around the world and maintaining security is changing dramatically. One has to consider the ongoing threat of terrorism and particularly cyber terrorism. But I fail to understand how, if you're a disgruntled teenager in Lebanon working hard to put a cyber threat on our NHS, for example, how a nuclear weapon is actually going to help our government address that problem. Whereas I would argue very strongly that making sure that through diplomacy and development there was a stable government, that youngster had their opportunities for economic development is a much easier, more realistic, achievable, and ultimately satisfactory way of preventing them from carrying out cyber terrorism. But again, it's that lack of joined up thinking that I'm seeing going on in this document. The other thing which I find very, very concerning is poverty is almost non-existent in the document. We all know that poverty is one of the main reasons that we see instability around the world. And by not grasping that, by not looking at that bigger picture, I think it's a real missed opportunity. And ultimately, it's going to be more expensive if we deal with the consequences of not addressing poverty. And I'll give you one very concrete example, although we haven't got the exact figures yet. When you look at the Sahel region, we are seeing that an awful lot of existing ODA funding, development funding, is going to be withdrawn from that region. Now, that's already an unstable region. But the other thing, which is actually the director of the World Food Programme said to me, is why doesn't your government understand that there are already really established trafficking routes out of that country? So you're seeing a lot of modern slavery coming out of there, a lot of refugees coming out of there. So does your government not understand that if you don't plug that country, that region, then terrorists are also going to use those well-established routes and get into your country that way? And it's that sort of lack of thinking that really makes me quite nervous. It makes me think that it doesn't actually understand what development does and what development can do. The other thing that I want to end on really is the statement, and again I paraphrase, developing nations need to be more self-sufficient through trade. Well, yes, they do, but where are we going to be in that relationship? Is this just a commercial relationship that we're having? Is it an altruistic relationship we're having? Is it a soft power relationship we're having? I have my opinions. I don't think that the government, it either doesn't know why it's doing it or it doesn't want to say why it's doing it. And then my final point is, I was asking the clerks on the committee today how this review is being seen internationally. And it's basically being seen as a post-Brexit where we're positioning ourselves in the world. It's not seen as sort of ambitious. It's not seen as strategically important in relation to them. And I think that that again is if the government genuinely is trying to reposition us, then the fact that it's a damp squib in relation to the people that ought to be looking to rally around us and be stakeholders with us, and indeed go, oh my goodness, how wonderful the British government is, of course we want to support them. It's failed on those counts. And that really concerns me going forwards, not least because when it comes to the development strategy, we're told it's now going to be in 2022, and the other parts of the details of this review, we still haven't got dates for. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. And we campaign for DFID to be, we will be campaigning for DFID to be re-established, which is obviously, I mean, shocking we're in this position, but the absence of development in this review, for me, was a perfect example of why you need that standalone department, because without them round the table, around the cabinet table, you do see the results of that development does get, becomes an afterthought. So thanks for those remarks, that's really great. And I'd like to now, we've got 45 minutes left, and I'd like to now hand over to my fellow host and co-chair of the Labour Friends of the Forces, Sarah Church, for the Q&A.
Thanks very much, David. And thanks to all our speakers for your insights. Really, really interesting. We've got a few questions up already. I will start with a quick 1 minute on Labour Friends of the Forces, just in case people are wondering what it's about. It's been going for nearly 10 years and was forged by a will to create a forum for serving and ex-serving personnel, along with those close with them, because Labour needs to be and is deeply rooted in the needs of our service communities. And this is about strengthening the link between Labour and our serving communities. And we're a forum for discussion, development and ideas sharing. And so that's what we're about. Right, I have questions. Some are directed at panelists individually, but the first ones I'd like to put out there is 2 questions. They're both a bit long, but I'd like to put them to all panelists because they really cover actually those interfaces between defence, diplomacy and development that some feel perhaps are lacking in the thinking of the integrated review. So Caroline asks, 2 omissions from the review are A, no reference to the women, peace and security agenda, B, no understanding of the links, interconnectedness between poverty, inequality, and this is what Sarah was talking about just now, in particular gender equality and women and girls empowerment and conflict. How can Labour address these issues? And would you agree they should be central features and priorities for Labour to address in our foreign policy and aid programmes going forward? So that's from Caroline. And then actually Rocco has a question which supplements that, because the integrated review indicates an expansion of remote warfare and security partnerships, especially with Nigerian and Somali armed forces in Africa, in Iraq and others in the Middle East. Yet there is no mention of ensuring that partners comply with international rights standards, human rights standards this is. And the UN has listed the armed forces of these countries and their auxiliaries for committing grave violations against children. is this a recipe for outsourcing security without ensuring civilians are protected? So 2 longish questions, but some good stuff maybe for all 3 panelists to get into. And perhaps because Jack, you're unmuted, I might come to you first.
Right, well, here I am. I mean, it is a terrible omission, not to mention the issue of women and girls, and as we know, they are. I mean, particularly if you take the issue simply of sexual violence in conflict, this is by men overwhelmingly directed against women and against girls, and with all sorts of horrific examples from around the world, both now and historically. How do you deal with this? Well, we deal with this by using the powers that we have to campaign in Parliament and outside this kind of forum to embarrass the government into thinking, oh yes, because Boris Johnson pays, and so does the modern Conservative Party, pays lip service to the idea of there being equality between the sexes and there being a prominent role for women in for example, in his cabinet and in government. Fine, but it's not actually embedded in their thinking. So, I mean, that's I think the specific thing I'd say, and that's what we've got to do, to keep emphasising on remote warfare, and do we turn a blind eye to international norms if we are working with Nigerian troops and others? I don't think we can. I mean, obviously they're working in an extremely difficult environment, but I mean, George can talk more about this, but if they are, as we think they are, completely ignoring international norms and just going in for brutality and indiscipline, these are not the kind of troops which is a good idea for us to be involved with anyway, and that they are unlikely to achieve their political objectives if they act in a way that from a point of view of the local population isn't much better than that of the terrorists, in this case in northern Nigeria, for example, Boko Haram, who they're trying to defeat. So there, as often with things like international norms, there are both reasons of principle to be involved with them, but also it actually makes a lot of practical sense to do so.
Thank you very much. I'll come to you, Sarah, next. I realise you have to go in 10 minutes, and it'd be great to hear what you've got to say about, I think, human rights. Got a good reaction from you at that point.
It did indeed. I mean, at some point, I hope politicians will recognise that women and girls make up 51% of the population. And we're actually quite good on peacekeeping, negotiating, stabilisation of countries. But unfortunately, as Jack alluded to, rape is used routinely as a weapon of war. I mean, we see that going on right now in Ethiopia. What we need to be doing is recognising the role that women play, particularly in stabilising countries and peacekeeping. So one example would be in Yemen at the moment, where in the north of the country, most of the work around peacekeeping, around community support is being done by women. And you're just missing a trick if you're not engaging with them right at the very beginning. I mean, I know it's very exciting to talk about bombs and how many tanks you've got, and it's all very macho, but unfortunately women are actually quite good at counting tanks, and we're quite good at driving as well. So we could actually be involved at the head of the table. And it just frustrates me enormously when the atrocities that we're seeing carried out, so I'm thinking violence against women and girls, aren't seen as war crimes, whereas shooting someone in the leg is. And I just think when we're looking at creating a peaceful society long term, to not be including those women in the peace building process is such a short-sighted thing to do. And then one more thing, we've just done an inquiry into sexual abuse by aid workers. And the UN peacekeeping forces are pretty notorious about doing this. And we need to, the quickest way to address this and prevent this is by getting more women involved in those troops, getting them physically on the ground, talking to the communities and curbing some of the excesses which give all forces a bad name would be a really sensible and a really smart thing to do. And I, you know, Boris loves talking up, I don't think he's ever used the word feminist, but he loves presenting himself, you know, girls' education, that sort of thing. Well, actually, this review was the opportunity to literally put your money where your mouth is and make a real difference, be a world leader, rather than just talking the talk. But again, it's another opportunity that's just been failed.
Thank you very much indeed for that, Sarah. George, would you like to add your views?
Yeah, the question is a bit unfair, actually, because on page 48 of the integrated review, it does say we'll promote gender equality, working with women's rights organisations to tackle discrimination, violence and inequality that hold women back. We'll use our aid spending and diplomacy to pursue the goal of getting 40 million more girls into school in low middle income countries, etc. You know, so that, you know, now whether that translates into action is a matter of debate, but you know, it is one of the commitments that is laid down here, and so is the question of universal human rights. That's being undermined by the Overseas Services Bill that is coming back to the Lords in a couple of weeks' time, and we'll try and get that changed there. But essentially, the government is committed to these principles, so there's no question about operating with unofficial militias who are debasing human rights and the rest of that as well. And you know, and I made a sort of frivolous comment earlier on about Claire Short being called Bomber Short by her political opponents on the left. And who knows, she might actually be out there watching this just now. But the reason was that she recognized that what we did in Kosovo, which was ending basically a genocide that was taking place, was something that we should use our armed forces for. But secondly, she came to the Ministry of Defence on a number of occasions in order to get military training into some of the countries in Africa where she could see that if you actually reorganized and regulated the army in these countries, you stabilize democracy in those countries, because largely they were unstable because of the random effects of the military forces in these countries. And you can see that self-evident. Look at Myanmar today, you know, or Venezuela today, where the armed forces are effectively the brutal side of dictatorship. So, you know, we could see that by the British Army giving advice and reorganizing in these countries, you actually had more of an impact sometimes than by food aid at that time as well. So, you know, we shouldn't lose sight of that. And we need to, in terms of Labour policy, make much more of it in our foreign policy in the future.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm going to take advantage of the last 5 minutes of Sarah's time to put in some specific development questions. And there were a couple of follow-ups actually on the piece about, you know, a comment that it's hard to get more girls into school when aid cuts are defunding girls' education. So, you know, if anyone knows how that miracle will be achieved, that may be worth a comment. Also, a critical issue is reproductive rights, obviously linked, a critical plank of gender equality. And I'm going to add in a separate but development-based question around, has anyone had a look at what the impact on the British economy will be, given the fact that many people are employed in development in the UK, looking at overseas aid? So multiple questions, Sarah. Thank you for your answers.
Well, I agree with the first 2 points, and it shows the thought process, which is that the rights of women and girls are a bolt-on, not an absolute core. And yes, I completely agree with George. You know, there is mention of it, but when you look at the fact that currently of the development money, only 0.3% of it goes to preventing violence against women and girls, that's where, you know, that shows the real commitment, and it is where the money goes that we need to see where the intention is. It's a really interesting point that you make about sort of the industry of development and the number of UK jobs. It's also for me about value for the UK taxpayer. So I know that I've been a big campaigner for the 0.7. What I'm actually a campaigner for is to understand where aid is going, how it's best spent, what the outcomes of that money are, and where we ought to be targeting our money in the future. And again, you know, I would have welcomed the integrated review to look at that, and as I said, put our cards on the table about that. But it shies from it in terms of sort of the international soft power that development gives to us. It's enormous. I mean, I'm friends with a lot of, well, not a lot, a number of Jamaican politicians. And as soon as the cuts to aid were announced, they came straight back to me and said, well, why would we want to do business with you? You know, it's not conditional, but it is a sweetener to do a deal with you as opposed to China. And I think that's one of the things that we ought to also think about. You know, China, and there's a question that I was just answering, you know, Africa and the whole demographics around that is going to be the fastest growing region in terms of population, but also it's the fastest growing region in terms of economic potential if we can, you know, support and empower that. So as a trade potential for the UK, all of our historic, not always good, relationships with African nations, those sort of shared values, those shared legal and political basis, that could have been a huge opportunity for us to use our existing developmental reach. Adding on to that, you know, that there is a real security risk if we don't maintain those relationships with Africa. So it just frustrates me that this review could have been so much more. And can I just say, because poor Wayne's not had a get in, I really appreciate the commitments that our front bench are making to development, the sensible things that they're putting forward around sort of the international law, around human rights and around diplomacy. That's what we need to be seeing. Whereas at the moment, as I said, it does seem to be quite boys' toys. And one final thing, because I'm on the committee, we have loads of amazing specialists that work for us. And in all of the leaks that came out, nuclear weapons, no one knew about until the day it dropped. And I do wonder if it is a smokescreen to capture the media attention and stop us talking about the lack of practical detail within this review.
Thank you very much for really, really fascinating insights, and for joining the panel tonight, Sarah. We really, really appreciate it, and for all the work that you're doing as well, holding the government to account and scrutinising. So as prompted, Wayne, if you're happy to answer any of the questions we've been through to this point, please do come in and let us know what you think.
Well, if I could just respond to a couple of the points. I mean, firstly, you know, I think George is correct in pointing out, but our references to women and women's education and gender equality, and that's good in the document. But is the question of, you know, are they just words? What is behind it, and what is the government doing to prioritise these issues? And I think that's the telling point, really. I think that, you know, the government, in a sense, has watered down its own right-wing rhetoric to be more accommodating and appealing. But when we dig beneath the surface, there's very little there. And similarly, as far as human rights is concerned, I mean, I take the point about the Middle East. I think there should be far more references to the Middle East. And we know that's a difficult area for the government because of the contradictions between defense and our presence in Bahrain, for example, and other places. And our need to maintain an approach which it keeps the Gulf states firmly as allies, but at the same time, we shouldn't turn a blind eye to the appalling human rights abuses which are taking place in so many of the states of the Middle East. And I think that one of the things is that, you know, when we have a Labour government, human rights around the world will be looming large yet again. It'll be at the very top of our priorities. And while I've got the floor, as it were, could I just say that one of the most encouraging things I've been involved in is something which Jack has been extremely involved in, and that's the highlighting of the abuse which took place during the Vietnamese War by Korean soldiers of Vietnamese women, the so-called Lai Dai Han. And I think that history has turned a blind eye to the appalling abuse which took place during that time. And I think actually by highlighting things which happened admittedly a long time ago, it's important in itself, but it also helps to set a more meaningful and more moral agenda for what we want to see in the future.
Thank you very much, Wayne. There's been an interesting question come in, which is absolutely correct, from Rishi. No one has mentioned coronavirus so far, or the thorny issue of vaccine diplomacy. Interested to hear the panel's views on what more Labour can say on this issue in the context of the integrated review. Excellent question. And George, shall I come to you first?
Yeah, well, one of the best aspects of the review is actually about domestic resilience. And, you know, I'm sitting on a special House of Lords Select Committee just now looking at risk and risk assessment. And it's one of the clear sort of weaknesses that we have. And we're not alone, because in fact, our risk register is better than it is in most other countries. But, you know, to have run an exercise on a flu pandemic in 2016, but apparently then to have learned no lessons at all about the supply of PPE. You know, before this pandemic, we only produced 1% of the required PPE in this country. So we didn't learn anything from that at all. But actually, you know, there is quite a substantial part in here that talks about the way in which there needs to be a much more robust system of identifying risks and planning for risks and planning for the cascading of risks that can so easily happen in countries. So it's right and proper that it should be there. Again, though, the question is the delivery system. You know, Peter Ricketts, Lord Ricketts, former permanent secretary at the Foreign Office, asked a very good question last week in the Lords when the statement came out. He said, "This is very ambitious," he said, "but given the constraints on the budget, what is it we're going to do less of?" And actually, it's not a bad question to ask when you've got a very, very ambitious review. So that's what worries me. In terms of resilience, they lay out a very good plan and how to coordinate and the rest of it. But can they carry it through? Can they execute it? That's a bigger question.
Thank you very much, George. Jack, would you like to chip in? Oh, you're on mute. It's good we got this far in without having to say that.
It's unusual for me to be muted. There we are.
Quite a good thing, though, yeah.
I know you think that, George. Is all right. But I mean, look, just picking up what George said. I mean, this is not just this government in the last 10 years, but we did too. We put too much emphasis on, well, basically neglecting a lot of our manufacturing base and not having a strategic view, except in the defence area, specific defence area, about what we ought to be making in our national interest in this country. And that's not in terms of pulling out the drawbridge, but we are, you know, we've got an astonishing scientific base, and thank God this is now being expanded. But even stuff as simple, relatively simple, as face masks and perspex shields and all the rest of it, not to have had any capacity, and for no one to have noticed that we had any capacity, is a sort of serious dereliction of government. So we need to build that up. I mean, so far as the current argument between ourselves and the European Union is concerned, I'm clear, but more to the point, so most people in Europe, that the problem actually is not the British government. I mean, so we just need to, you know, set out, pick our targets carefully. It's because of the lamentable failure by Ursula von der Leyen and the Commission in deciding they could organise this centrally and not having themselves having the capacity to do so. And by the by, I mean, I get a translation of the German press every day, and they're not taken in by the idea that AstraZeneca has failed in its contractual obligations to Europe. They believe, as everybody does, that it's just a sort of catastrophic failure by the European Union with all sorts of really damaging implications for the EU's reputation and the way this is going to feed Euroscepticism within the 27. And as for what, if the purpose of the question is, what should the government do now? We shouldn't go in for COVID nationalism. I mean, the first duty of any government is to its own people. So this government, I mean, you can't take it away from them, having dealt with the pandemic in a most terrible way, which is why we got the highest death rate population around the world almost, have now got it together, and a very significant proportion of the population is being vaccinated, and that can only help by the by across Europe as well. I mean, what I hope is going to happen, and there is some indication that this is what Johnson is doing, is we reach some kind of voluntary agreement with the rest of Europe about sharing the available AstraZeneca vaccines. Although it's ironical that in Germany and France, they still have millions of unused doses of this stuff because they've been running this completely perverse, ignorant campaign against the use of the AstraZeneca vaccine. Suddenly realize it works just as well as the Pfizer one, and wonder why the population are resistant. But anyway, it's about cooperation, and coming back to the issue of what should our approach be to diplomacy in Europe. I'm amused by the fact Johnson's picking up the phone to Merkel and to Macron. I'm sort of wondering, well, what's the response at the other end? But you need to develop and build up and nurture relationships with countries and their leaders. In the good times when you don't particularly need to make a phone call to somebody, because when you do, it really does make a huge difference in practice if you've built up those relationships and mutual understanding.
Thank you very much, Jack. Wayne.
I would make the general point that one of the big questions which is beginning to loom on the horizon is the unfair access people across the globe are having to the coronavirus vaccines. And I think that's likely to become one of the big geopolitical issues of the future. But because I am also concerned with the situation which exists now, not just what Jack has highlighted, but in my particular area, the area I'm responsible for on the front bench, Middle East and North Africa. If you look at the situation in Israel, which has got the highest vaccination rate of anywhere in the world, and a variety of reasons for that. One of the reasons is because Netanyahu in the election year paid more for the vaccines than anybody else. But right next door is the Palestinian occupied territories, where there's negligible vaccines in existence. And Israel is doing, in real terms, very little to help the vaccination program in the occupied territories. And one of the things which I would like to see the British government calling for is basically Israel to work together with the Palestinians to make sure there's a common program developed. And because that's the only way, from an Israeli point of view, they can be sure of having long-term safety. But it's also the decent and humanitarian thing to do. And I think that issue is going to be replicated in many, many ways throughout the world over the next few years. And it's something we have to be conscious of.
Thank you very much. I'm going to ask a sort of follow-on question about domestic security and then get on to some slightly more pointed questions about our force posture, about numbers and things, and the modernisation of the British forces, particularly the army. So there's a question from Toby, and I'm going to add a slight supplementary to it. He says the review touches on homeland security and transnational threats, but says nothing really about the threats of espionage or subversion. Should these threats, articulated in last year's ISC Russia report, be given greater attention? And I felt that linked somewhat to your points, Jack, around Gazprom and societal resilience to threats perhaps to our energy security, information security. The Chief of Defence Staff made some comments towards the end of last year around how our resilience as a society is actually everybody's responsibility, and some countries you know, take that quite far. Some of our Scandinavian neighbours do that. So I wondered if you had comments to any of those points. Who'd like to start? Maybe I should ask for volunteers this time.
Can I just say that, you know, we've mentioned, you know, there's a lack of attention in the documents to individual countries apart from Russia and China in the defence context, and that's quite deliberate. And it was the same with our review in 1998, which I just happen to have a copy of here. The original foreign policy baseline had a lot of value judgments about individual countries, and Robin Cook and I both said, oh, you know, we can't possibly do that. You know, you can't say this country can be trusted, that country can't be trusted. So you have to deal with it in generic terms, you know, and, you know, I'm sure Jack would agree that the Foreign Office cannot possibly be burdened with, you know, a momentary sort of view about that. So you've got generic concepts built in here as well. But the review rightly focuses on the grey area of defence, and in many ways the force posture in the defence review is related to these new domains of cyber, space, disinformation. You know, the way in which countries that are outgunned by us, by and large, and NATO, you know, we outspend Russia and indeed China massively. So they have now started to focus, along with Iran and North Korea, on this grey area. So it's to do with espionage, corruption, interfering in elections. It's to do with disinformation, you know, cyber warfare, all of these things. And we have got to focus on that. We're not going to need tank armies because the Soviet Union is gone and Russia is not going to invade across the North German plain. But we do need to have access to information that is going to deal with these grey area threats which are affecting us up to now. So the ISC report on Russian interference is an extremely important one, and I don't think the government have really sufficiently focused on that today. And, you know, going back to Nord Stream, actually Gerhard Schröder, the former Chancellor of Germany, Social Democratic Chancellor of Germany, is actually the chairman not only of Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2, but of Rosneft, the big energy company in Russia at the present moment. So there's a bit of a battle brewing between the United States, who want to sanction Nord Stream 2, the second pipeline, and Germany, who are clinging onto it as an economic interest.
Thank you very much, George. I'm sure we're going to come back to force posture and tanks and boots in just a moment. Jack, would you like to comment?
Well, on the issue of the intelligence agencies, I mean, actually, I mean, in fairness to the document, as George has indicated, there is a strong theme running through it about how we deal with the kind of modern threats, which are many of which are electronic rather than physical threats. And the agencies have done, as I mentioned in my opening, good reasons, but they've done reasonably well out of successive government spending rounds, particularly since 2001. And there was the view after the collapse of the Soviet Union, collapse of the Berlin Wall, and then the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s, that there was a substantial peace dividend which did directly affect particularly parts of the armed forces. But also, for example, when I became Home Secretary, the security service, MI5, was short of things to do. So it started doing quite a lot and good work on organized crime. But that's, I mean, you know, for all sorts of reasons, particularly post 9/11, they've had their hands absolutely full in terms of counterterrorism and all of that, and domestic subversion here. And SIS, MI6, and GCHQ, ditto in respect of overseas. So, on that side of things, on the whole, I mean, George is also heavily involved in it, is pretty well integrated. And I pick up from the document that it's going to stay that way. And one thing that Cameron did do, which I thought was an advance on the arrangements that we had in the Labour government was to establish this National Security Council with the chiefs of staff on it and the heads of the agencies as members, not just as those attending, and a core group of cabinet ministers as well. It's drawn on the US analogy, but it's a very good idea, and it's a way of producing that sort of day by day, week by week coordination on these things that you may not otherwise have.
Thanks very much. In the interest of time, I'm going to put that question to you, Wayne, but I'm also going to supplement it with, you know, we've heard George's views on the need for conventional forces somewhat. You know, do you agree that, you know, the modernisation and the cuts or the decrease in manpower is the right thing to do? And I just would add, given the length of time it takes to bring that back, to grow it into the force structure, and the same would go for allowing the obsolescence of the armoured capability, when again that takes a long time to bring into service.
I'll answer that, but could I just say a few remarks about the previous question?
Please do, Wayne. Yes, thank you.
You know, I think Jack's absolutely right. The National Security Council is a step forward, and I think we would want to maintain and possibly enhance its working in the future. But I also think that one of the things which is perhaps lacking in the integrated review is an acceptance, but it needs to be a different idea of who the defenders are. And I think that we have to move away from the traditional idea that the armed forces alone defend the country, and more towards, I think you said, Sarah, a Scandinavian idea, that is the people themselves have got a role to play in the defense of our country. And I think that one of the things that we need to do in Britain is to increase the awareness of the population, just how wars may well be conducted in the future. And I think we had an indication of that when it came to the poisoning in Salisbury, for example. But that could well become commonplace in a situation where we were involved in a real struggle against another power. So I think that's important. The second point I'd make is with regard to our conventional defence. You know, I think that we need to have a debate inside the Labour Party about the size of our armed forces. I think that the document is right, and I think if we had a Labour government in power now, they would want to invest much more in technology, in security, in innovation, in a whole host of different ways. But I'm very reluctant to say that should be at the expense of our traditional armed forces, if you like. And you know, I think that's a debate that we need to be thinking about very, very carefully. There's a debate going on inside the Conservative Party and elsewhere about the size of the defence budget. Should it be 0.2% or should it be more? I think that's a debate that we have to be engaged in. And I think it's very, very important that we, as an opposition who are serious about winning power to next election, are not afraid to get involved in these difficult issues. Because I think if we are absolutely honest, one of the profound weaknesses of Labour in the last general election was that many people didn't trust Labour, thought we were going to be soft on defence, and we need to show that that is not the case. But Labour Party puts as its first priority the defence of our people. And if that means being involved in difficult debates, then so be it. But those debates must be held. Jack, did you want to come in?
No, I'm sorry. I was just commenting that we were being soft on defence.
So I've got a question here that I think there are several people who'd like to move on to, which is about your view on the FCDO's conflict centre. So how will this work effectively to address, in your view, conflict prevention, civilian protection, and responding to other agendas such as those we've talked about in the development space, perhaps, well, and conflict, women, peace and security, children, armed conflict, and so on. And maybe, Jack, you'd like to jump straight back into your views on that, and then we'll come back.
I'm afraid I don't know much about this conflict centre. I mean, the Foreign Office has always had conflict centres where it tries to bring together different areas of expertise to work on conflict resolution. And my guess is that what they're trying to do is to bring development arm into that as well. Well, it has to be said that even when the DFID was separate, I mean, obviously they were involved in this kind of organisation in any event. I mean, but that I think is the basis of it. And I mean, the test of these things is not whether you can gather these people in the room and what kind of policy capability you've got behind them, but what they do on the ground in specific conflicts. You know, that remains to be seen.
Yeah, I don't really know much about this either. And what worries me is that actually the review sort of suggests a whole series of new organisations being set up, but yet again within the same budget. So, you know, is this serious? There is a good case for a conflict centre so that these things can be examined and properly looked at as well. But it comes back to the National Security Council, because it's got the job, according to the review, and it has even at the present moment, the job of coordinating between all of these different organisations in government to make sure that they're acting in the national interest and that they're actually all doing what the centre wants it to happen. I should say that the idea of the National Security Council was actually an idea dreamt up by Paddy Ashdown and I in a report that we wrote for the IPPR in 2008 before the 2010 election. And we said that there had to be a National Security Council to bring together all security government departments. So you had one venue, because Jack and I will remember the times when we were trying to coordinate in a sometimes quite haphazard, but albeit successful way. So I had a very big panel of experts there. Paddy Ashton and I co-chaired it. It was published. The Tories just took it, the whole thing. They took the whole idea of the National Security Council out of our report and implemented it after 2010. But Gordon Brown and his people decided they weren't going to do anything about it before the election. But you know, it's now got a pivotal role now in coordinating between all these government departments and the new centres, like the conflict centre and the resilience organisations as well. And we've got to hope that they all manage to do it and to do it successfully. But they're doing it on exactly the same budget as exists at the moment, and that's a big task.
Wayne, the last word on this last question.
Well, I agree very much with George, and I've learned something about the homework which he and Paddy Ashton were doing, and it was excellent, and it's come to fruition, and I certainly would want to build upon that in the future.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
That report warned about the dangers of a pandemic. It was one of the central recommendations.
Yes.
Warning.
Yes, and I have read it.
Yeah.
Thank you all very much. Thank you to everybody who asked a question. I do apologise if I didn't get to your question. I tried to pick up on all the main themes. And thanks very much indeed to all of our panellists and to Sarah, who couldn't stay beyond 6 o'clock, for some excellent and in-depth answers. At this point, I'll hand back over to Jess to conclude the event.
Thanks, Sarah. And in conclusion, I wanted to just again add my thanks to Wayne, George, Jack and Sarah for joining us this afternoon for what has turned out to be a fascinating discussion on a very wide-ranging subject. It's clear that a set of questions have emerged about how the government is actually intending to achieve the objectives it set out in the role, particularly around the question of resources and what infrastructure is needed. Two big things that we've picked up on here are, is there a particular development plan? Is there a particular Middle East plan? Things that have been missing. And it sounds like we're going to have to wait for a lot of the answers. But obviously, in the meantime, Labour is running its international policy review. Wayne shared information about that on his Twitter feed. The review is open until the 8th of April. If anybody on the call is inclined to make a submission, Labour Foreign Policy Group is running one under the leadership of Rishi Patel, who has been on the call. If you'd like to be involved in that, do be in touch with us. Final thank you to everyone who attended for all of your interesting and challenging questions. Big thank you to Leila from Coalition for Global Development, who supported in the organisation of the event. And if you'd like to know anything more about any of our organisations, you can check out our websites, labourforeignpolicy.org.uk, labourforces.org and lcid.org.uk. Again, thank you everyone, and I hope to see you soon at one of our future events.
Thank you.